The word for today is Gauvain. Gauvain is the word. It's the last name, but it's also a first name, and it's used in France. And it's also used in Quebec. And there's lots of Gauvains in Quebec. And there's Gauvain Automobile, Gauvain the hardware store. There's all sorts of Gauvains all around Quebec. It's a very common last name. Maybe a couple of generations ago, it was also a first name. So you had some people who were called Gauvain as a first name. And I wonder because I had a long time ago, I had a student, and his name was the same. He had the same first name and last name, and that was one of the one interesting. There's a few of these out in Quebec. I'd like to list them, but in order to preserve and to these people are still alive, so I don't want to name them. I wonder if there was ever been a Gauvain. At any rate, Gauvain is interesting because originally it comes from Wales. It's a Welsh name. And as we follow this name, well, it's an interesting ride, definitely. And so let's begin. So we have a beer, a word, and a book. So we start off with the beer. It's wonderful beer, and I'm going to have a YOLO. One of the reasons that I open a beer is that there's no stopping, there's no editing, and we just go and we just push on through. So let's push on through. Let me begin now with this wonderful person here, Gauvain. So let's look at the history of Gauvain. Right. So why did the French all of a sudden um, start using a name that comes from Wales? Well, let's look at this. Whoops, goodness gracious. Let's look at this from a broader point of view. How do words come into a language? Usually, it has to do with something that happens that's very big, that affects a lot of people. You don't have situations where you have two communities living side by side, and then suddenly you have, let's say, they take one word or they take another word. Usually, there's a trend, there's a massive thing going on. Typically, wars are and conquest, and followed by acculturation, where you lose one of the two different peoples or the two different languages. The two different languages lose out in favor of the stronger one, militarily stronger one. So that's the common thing. That's the common situation. But rarely things happen in a different way. So here's an example of, and this happened in Quebec in 1976. Montreal, there were the Olympics in Montreal, and everyone in Quebec was watching the Olympics that summer. And the star of the Olympics, of the 1976 Montreal Olympics, was a young girl by the name of Nadia Comaneci. And Nadia Comaneci was acing her routines one after the other, and then she became the star of the Olympics. She became very, very famous in Quebec. And subsequently, a few years later, so that was 1976. I was not able to get the statistics for 1976, 77, 78 to show the evolution of this, but the number of Nadia girls named Nadia in Quebec. So in their birth names. So in 1980 there were 279, 1981 274, and then it drops down like this, and we see in 1993 down to 57. in order to get this foreign name, Nadia was not a common name in Quebec before 1976. But this big event, so what kind of event are we talking about? We're talking about television. So everyone's in front of their television. There's a success. There's a like the same thing is happening in all around for a great large number of people that share the same common experience. That's how you have words enter from one language to another. You can think of the automobile, for example, cars. In Quebec, a lot of English words, English borrowings, informal English borrowings, come from from cars. So in the 20th century, with the car came a lot of vocabulary associated with the car. Today, computers, of course, have this massive impact as well. So we'll say in Quebec, we'll talk about a CPU, which is a CPU, of course. We'll talk about RAM in French. We'll talk about, CPUs, and well, that's enough. Two is enough for now. But all words that have to do with the computers. So that's the kind of thing we need. So when we think about Gauvain, and Gauvain being this foreign name arriving in France at a certain time, one thing we know for sure, it has to be associated with one big, massive event that would be relatively easy to pinpoint, actually, because of its size. And that's going to color the way that the name is perceived. Of course, as a Welsh name, Gauvain is Gauvain, and Gauvain may not have had such significance in Wales. It might have been just like a regular name or a normal name that many people would have had for a whole bunch of different reasons. But as they come into the different culture through this same process, through this one big event, they're going to have associated with it some specific characteristics. So that's kind of what we're looking for here. So let's look at this. Let's go and hunt down this Gauvain. Gauvain, we know without looking too far that it's part of the Arthurian novels and Arthurian stories, and what is called the Matter of Britain. And the Matter of Britain is there's a bit of confusion, at least in the things that I've read, where the Matter of Britain, in French especially, there's this confusion between Bretagne, which is in France La Bretagne, where they speak Breton, and the Matter of Britain, or La Matière de Bretagne, where essentially it's Wales, isn't it? It's what we would associate with Welsh culture. So Gauvain, Gauvain, and the French version of Gauvain is Gauvain, is essentially a Welsh phenomenon. And it's associated with with King Arthur and his knights at the Round Table, and he's one of the knights. He's one of many knights. So the first question we should ask is, why this guy? Why Gauvain? Why Gauvain? Why is he chosen as a person worthy of taking his name, but not Arthur? Now, strangely, Arthur is popular in Brittany, but overall in France, not as much. There's a cultural difference. We can see this by looking at a map that was made by Pierre Gallet, and it was published posthumously in 2014. So I don't know the specifics of the origin of that story, but I'm just looking at the product, and I'm just finding it really interesting. 1155. So in 1155, the names both Arthur and Gauvain, start to appear in France. So right here in Poitou, you find, so in this map, if you if you want to look at it and pause or whatever, the you might see that the squares or lozenges are Gauvain, and the circles are for Arthur. And what you see here in the northern part, well, if you can see I don't know if you can see my little arrow, but in Brittany you have all these circles, and this is Arthur, Arthur, Arthur. And then in here, we have all of these Gauvains appearing. And Gauvain is here, and he's also in the north in this area. And in this other area, well, maybe we can just ignore it for now, but it's mainly Arthur's as well. But Gauvain is really popular here, and starting at 1155. And before that date, he doesn't find them. So Pierre Gallet doesn't find these names. So this gives us a time frame. So we need a big, we need something big, a big phenomenon happening before 1155, and where we only see a trace of that phenomenon. But certainly we understand it's a big one because the parents are actually calling their children by these names. So the parents, I guess if you wanted to look at the numbers a little bit, you could imagine, for example, the parents growing up with stories of Gauvain, of Gauvain, and the Knights of the Round Table, and then when they come to adulthood and start naming their children, then they're going to be doing that. So if we take 20 years off of that 1155, we've got something like 1135-ish. So let's start with that. I'm talking about this, of course, because in Quebec, Gauvain is a common name, and and the first Gauvain to arrive in Quebec was Jean Gauvain, and he arrived in 1643, and he was from what in those days was called Poitou, but today is called Charente-Maritime, and it's just to confuse people. I don't think there's much more reason for that, but it's this region here in red. Typically, Quebecers come from three different regions. There's Paris, there's the Poitou, and in the north, at the very north of Normandy, a place called the Pays de Caux. So that region is one of the regions, and one of the three regions where, at the time of New France, people were coming in. So then we have this connection. So we have Gauvains in this place, and Gauvains later on coming into Quebec accidentally. Of course, this is like 500 years later. It's interesting for other reasons, but because, well, I'll tell you now. I guess the reason for that is Quebec was a really good place for cultural preservation, folklore preservation, and traditional stories, traditional songs preservation. France underwent the revolution in 1789, whereas Quebec was not in that situation. The revolution in France made it that, you had public education, and you had a standardization of language, and a whole mindset that was not very conducive to respecting and continuing folklore and traditions. At the Romantic period in 1850, these will be the mindset will change, but the damage will have been done. Whereas in Quebec, the people were collecting, and I think people are still collecting today. But at least until the 70s and the 1980s, people were still collecting songs, collecting stories, and so forth. Hence, we do have a connection here between the names as the product of a cultural transmission situation, and then this area being very important to the as a place of origin for Quebecers. But certainly that's one of the reasons why Gauvain is such a common name here, although its origin is unknown by Quebecers. Most people called Gauvain here would not know or not be familiar with the idea that their name actually comes from one of the knights of the Round Table. And so here we have, that's a picture of Great Britain and Ireland, and most likely you're familiar with this. This is the little picture of the Matière de Bretagne. Right, and just specifying that these stories come from Wales. And if we talk about King Arthur, they most likely originate in the 6th century, so late antiquity, at a time when Rome is not able to provide the services of safety, security, and legal services, and administration, taxation, roads, and as they're moving out, so Germanic tribes are arriving, and hence King Arthur, as a protector of the realm, is born. So King Arthur is very much in that dynamic. And then there's of course, the legend of the Green Knight. So the legend of the Green Knight, I'm not going to give you the whole story. The reason why I want to talk about the legend of the Green Knight is because it focuses on Gauvain, or Gauvain. And part of the reason, it might explain the reason why it was chosen at the time. So in favor, rather than Arthur, because Arthur would be the most likely candidate. I mean, the better known of the characters of the Arthurian court would be Arthur. So why this Gauvain? Why this Gauvain? Well, Gauvain is in the story of the Green Knight that you may be very familiar with, and apologies in advance for going fast here, but so there's the idea of a challenge, first of all, and a challenge to the death. And so there's a Green Knight, there's a giant, and it's all green, and he's going to challenge Gauvain, and he's going to say that, okay, you cut my head and I'll cut your head. If you can cut my head, you come and meet me in my place in 1 year, and I'll try to cut your head. So of course, well, not of course, but after much thought, Gauvain takes up the challenge, and he's being ridiculed and so forth, and he can't stand it. So he, with his sword, cuts the head off of the giant, and you would think that that was the end of the story. That was a stupid challenge, but no. This monster, this green monster, picks up his head, his own head, and holding his head, and in the direction of Gauvain, the mouth moves and speaks and says to Gauvain, well, okay, you did your part. Now I'm going to do mine, and come and meet me next year in my home, in my castle, in my green castle. A year later, he goes off on this journey. And so this is, I think, what's interesting about Gauvain and the story of Gauvain, and why he was selected, or why he was singled out in France. It's the journey. He's going to go and save the monster's, the giant's wife in this castle far away. And that's one part of it. Number two is he's going to take up this challenge to the death. He's going to actually go and face death. So that's a number two aspect of this story. And the third aspect of the story is that women like him. He's really, really popular with the ladies, one would say. So whenever, as he goes through his adventures, and as he goes through his journey, women come to him, and women swoon, and they love him. They think he's really cool, and he's really nice, and he's nice to women. He loves women. And there's no morality involved in this tale, and morality is not about that. And morality is about love and about how he loves women and how women love him. Something like that. I know I'm being very quick here, but that's part of his appeal, and part of the reason why later on he's going to be kind of not singled out, but moved away or ignored more, or set aside as the matter of Britain continues in France. Lancelot is going to be the more popular person, or the one that people feel that they need to show up more. Lancelot, because he has a pure heart, and he's much more about religion, less about the women, something like that. So that's really more or less the way that I would see a difference between someone like Gauvain. In Italy, in northern Italy, in one of the places where the Crusaders would go through. Oh, did I talk about the Crusaders? So I haven't talked about the Crusades. So here's what you need to know. The big event, the really big event at the time, would be the Crusades. Especially the first one, but first one, second one, that's another thing. But the Crusades. So the Crusades are about taking up this journey, and it's about saving the damsel in distress away in Jerusalem. So that's what these kind of stories about facing death and the challenge. That's the kind of mindset. So that's the kind of mindset that they were in. So there seems to be like this change between the original stories in Wales and how they're told and how they're selected and what elements are put forth at that time. So the Crusades seem to be the thing that's happening in terms of the transmission of these tales. If we look at northern Italy, this was built. So apparently there may be some questions about the time period it was built, and 1120 to 1140 is the one that I was able to find. I was not able to find anything more specific or anything that was more doubting this time frame. But 1120, that's quite early, and if we think of 1150, that was when the names started to appear, and then you've got 1120. Well, that's a nice time frame. That's getting close there. That's getting into the same kind of situation. What's interesting about this Modena, is it this? It's an arch in a church that was built around that time. When you look at the detail, so this is the very top of the arch. Now, at the very top of the arch, maybe 100 years later, it would have been unfathomable not to have something religious at this very important part of the structure. In this case, it's a woman. It's the woman in distress, and she's in the castle, and there's a monster right there, and that's the whole focus. And Gauvain, of course, is in this representation, this total representation. This focus on a woman in distress is not going to be represented later on. So this is still early 1120, but maybe 100 years later, you would have had, maybe if you'd had a woman, it would have been the Virgin Mary, and the cult, the Virgin Mary is going to be much more prevalent later on, actually. But at this very early time, it looks like it's interesting because there's not a lot of other comparables of that time period where you would have this just a woman. So first crusade is started. There's a call for the crusade for the first crusade in 11 not 11 but in 1095, and right and the crusade. So what is this thing about the crusades? Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people are gathering from everywhere in Europe and from Wales. So there's people also from Wales coming in, people from England, but it's especially the First Crusade. So when I've read about the First Crusade and the different crusades, the first one is kind of informal. It's very. I'm tempted to compare it to, and I know it's going to sound weird, but Woodstock. It's a little bit like Woodstock. It's kind of like people rising up, and there's a lot. It's very spontaneous, not a lot of forethought, and they're just abandoning their homes, abandoning their land, and going off on a crusade, leaving for a couple of years, and then maybe die. Of course, the crusade. So I do have to say that there's just some horrific things that happened during the crusades, as the crusaders marched or walked or crawled sometimes, because they're running out of food, into different villages or towns. They wreak havoc in the areas that they go through, and sometimes there's some situations where there's like wars or secondary wars, and then there's and Jews, of course, are getting killed left and right for absolutely no reason. So it's a very dramatic and very horrific thing in many aspects, and it's a testimony to how the brain and how people can be, and how ruthless and horrible some people can, that we all can be. At the same time, it is seen as a success. So the Second Crusade is not seen as a success, but the First Crusade is like, oh, the good old times, right? The good old days. And before the crusade even starts, the first thing that happens is you have people coming in and just staying for weeks upon weeks together. And my gosh, if you had a couple of bards from Wales coming in now, and they have a few songs to sing, they certainly would find an audience there. So about that. 1066, William the Conqueror, in Hastings, of course. He's going to be ruling, and French is going to be spoken by the higher classes, of course. Administrative language, legal language, and so on. In Wales, the Marcher Lords. Now, the Marcher Lords are placed there by William the Conqueror. But they show signs of being assimilated relatively rapidly. They marry into the local nobility, and even though they're colonials, even though that might be before, that might not be the right term, but they're kind of like colonials. They come in there to rule, and they're outsiders. But these continental lords are learning the language, and they're marrying into the local nobility, and and French is spoken, but Welsh as well. It's not so clear that that it's just going in one way. In fact, when you look at someone like William the Conqueror himself, I mean, he was the grandchild of something like a Viking. Well, he wasn't a Viking anymore in Normandy. I mean, his main language was French, and he had some elements, of course, of like traditional elements, legal things, and that arced to the time of the Vikings, but. He was not his grandfather. There was a lot of linguistic evolution there. So maybe this is the kind of thing that is happening. So we have 1066 with these Marcher Lords. 50 years later, Uh, it's there may yeah. So there's a back and forth there. There's a little bit of a back and forth there. So at the time of the First Crusades, um, there's also at the same time in Wales a great renaissance of literature. So literature is being written down, the stories and written down in Welsh, and then so yeah, and poetry's been written and created, and there's a local. It seems like there's an effervescence. That's just one element. But if you add to that the fact that suddenly there's a crusade, well, there's one more thing. There's communication, the boats. The Cistercian communities were, of course, very active at this time, and they're selling wine basically, and they're buying wool just to make things very, very, very simple. But there's a lot of back and forth. It's very easy to go to France if you're in the south part of Great Britain. All of a sudden, after 1066, certainly the wine now is being sold, whereas before 1066, it wasn't. So suddenly there's more communication. You've got a lot of culture happening in Wales. And then there's a crusade just across just across the pond, or just across the waterways. So I think it's quite conceivable that you have some. Now, how many Welsh bards would you need to have a big impact in Europe at this time? Honestly, because of the concentration of people, because of the Crusades, and that they're going to be listening for weeks and weeks before they go, then they're going to go and then eventually go home all around Europe. I think this is the big event that is working in favor for cultural transmission. And so the story of Gauvain harks back, or the story of the name Gauvain appearing in France around that time, 1155, comes from this condition where all the elements were just right for this to happen. Now, that's Gauvain. I think it's pretty clear from Gauvain because of his appearance suddenly, and because we know it's from Wales. And so, my gosh, what's happening at this time? It's the Crusade. The Crusades are helping, not helping, but they're selecting the kind of material that's going to work in France. Oh, and I should say that French was spoken in southern Wales around that time. Now, not for a very, very long time, but around that time between 1066 and say the Second Crusade, quote, French was widely spoken in Wales, in southern Wales. So you had people that could take stories and adapt them in French, and very well adapt them in French. So at the same time, the Cistercian monks are encouraging and getting Welsh literature to be written down. So if you look at these two things, one thing that I think would be was most likely is that this is just the tip of the iceberg. These are just the things that happened to be written down at the time, but the actual phenomenon was larger, because at least in Europe, stories of King Arthur, the Arthurian tales, they pop up in different places at different times, and sometimes more archaic versions appear in further places. And I think that's the reason for that is because there was a larger phenomenon going on, and we only see little bits and pieces appear here and there because only a few are written down, but it's mainly an oral tradition. And this is the time in France of the troubadours, and the troubadours were people who would and the jongleurs. The jongleurs are the people that would in the streets would tell stories. And of course, if there was a new story on the block, they'd be really interested in getting that story and then transmitting it to another person who would transmit it to another person. And so we have all these different elements just working together, kind of like a perfect storm sort of thing. And so that's basically it. So where does the name Gauvain come from? Well, it comes from Wales, and since it appears around 1155, most likely, it was through the medium of the apologies there, through the medium of the Crusades. So these were the Olympics of the time.